Good morning. This is me going on with the lecture. Sorry. Getting ready for my court appearance. Hopefully it goes well. Don't know if I'm dressed conservatively enough. All right, finishing up with Marx and Engels. Marx said the battle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, which of course the proletariat would win, would result in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Be on the lookout for that. There's certain words you can see used in articles and stimuluses and stimuli that you can tell means they're written by Marxists. If they're talking about the working class, if they're talking about the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat, obviously I'm not quite awake yet. I'm on my first cup of coffee. But the thing is, those are Marxist documents, and they're from a socialist perspective. So anyway, Marx said there's going to be revolution, and then the proletariat will rule. Now, everybody's going to be in the proletariat. But of course, you can't have, if you have a country with 100 million people, you can't have 100 million people in charge. So there's going to be a committee or something at the top. And that is why I think these places like North Korea and Cuba and Russia, especially the Soviet Union, have so much trouble and kill so many people. A lot of these people don't like the way the system is, and so they revolt and set this Marxist government up, and then they lose their power that they might have had in a system that allowed you to vote. Of course, many of these systems didn't allow you to vote, and so then you get all these tough rules put on you, and most people, in my opinion, don't like rules. Okay. We have to have rules. We have to have government, but most people do not like to be told what to do. That is just the essence of human nature. Anyway, the dictatorship of the proletariat. We talked about whether or not he was an atheist or someone who hated religion or hated God. Who knows? Here's the famous quote: "From each according to his ability, to each according to his need." So that eventually one day we're going to be so advanced that the doctor will, for free, the brain surgeon, work on the mechanic's brain. And the mechanic will, out of the goodness of his heart, work on the doctor's car. And everyone will do what everyone else needs. And this would be heaven. This is probably why this might have appealed to some Christians, where everybody automatically does what they think is right. For each other. And so everyone, you don't need a government. Everyone just automatically does what they're supposed to do. And you can decide if kids automatically do homework. If everyone is like that, you can decide based on your very young knowledge of human nature whether or not people will do the right thing given the chance. But anyway, one of his more famous quotes is "Workers of the world unite." Okay. All right, what did he miss? Okay, and I like to say, why was he wrong? Now, I don't want you to understand, I think the guy's a genius. I think he was maybe way ahead of his times, looking ahead of stuff here. But what I would say he missed is he's got two classes, bourgeoisie and proletariat. He could not have seen the growth of the middle class. And most of my students, most people have middle class values and want to be middle class. So the capitalist countries, a lot of them, we're going to get into this, because there are no full capitalist countries and there are no full socialist countries. There's countries that use a mixture. We use a fair amount of socialism ourselves, but we have a strong middle class. And it is possible, you guys right here in the classroom, I don't know if you're from a rich family or a poor family, but in this country, which is so maligned, and I make no apologies for being pro-America. I mean, I really don't. And why would I? There's none of these other countries I've been to. I mean, I did like Scotland that I would really want to move to. I want to stay here. I want to be here. Some of you in this classroom could be very, very poor right now. But within one generation, you guys, by the time you're 30, could be living in a middle-class neighborhood. It is possible for you to make it. Nice house, nice car. Your kids could go to good schools. You could live in a safe neighborhood. It is possible for you to do it. Have certain groups been kept down in the past? Yes, without a doubt. Are there going to be problems in the future? I think there will be. But this is a pretty good system, and most people in these countries are fairly happy. And so he could not have foreseen the growth of the middle class. One other thing I want you to write down here. I'm going to mention it later on, but I want to go ahead and mention it now. He writes 2 books that are famous, okay? I don't know if it's he wrote them or they wrote them. At this point, considering that I was wrong on 2 of the 3 things I said about Engels yesterday, I'm not wrong about Marx, I don't believe. But what I want you to write down is the name of his books. One of them, the big one, the Magnus Opus or Magnum Opus, whatever you call it, is Das Kapital, DAS space KAPITAL. The shorter one, which is really more like a pamphlet, which I read in like 45 minutes, is the Communist Manifesto. It's 80 pages long. And he ends up with the words, "Workers of the world unite." Now, here's what I want you to get. I'm not being mystical or anything like that, but every now and then a book will come out, and the date that it is published is, I don't know that it's significant, but it's an easy way to remember it. For instance, I would argue that the greatest example of capitalism in the world is England, and number 2 is probably the United States. Israel and now maybe Japan are also good examples, although Israel has a fair amount of socialism too. And so the deal is what was the Bible of capitalism? Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. When was it issued? Published 1776. 1776, the birth year of the United States. Now, Communist Manifesto. This is the book that sounds the clarion call to socialists all over the world. Hey, forget your socialist schemes. Mine is the good one, and there are going to be a lot of converts. We have a lot of famous Americans today that call themselves Marxists. Not the same as the ones that call themselves the socialists. Anyway, when was the Communist Manifesto issued? 1848. Okay? Now, that's going to be a significant thing later on at the tail end of the lecture. I'm getting ahead of the game here. But in the year 1848, in European history, multiple revolutions sweep Europe. They're liberal revolutions. They're not socialist revolutions. But there was fighting in the streets of 3, some people say 4 major countries. And they're collectively called the revolutions of 1848. And they were the common people wanting the rights that they thought had been offered to them by the French Revolution. Now, here's the thing that's interesting. Every one of these revolutions fails. None of them overthrow their king or whoever was in charge. So they all fail. But the smart politicians out there, including one guy who's probably still fairly young, named Otto von Bismarck, they see all these revolutions going on and they realize these people want rights and that we are eventually going to have to give them to them. So what a smart politician should do, if you realize, first off, if you don't have standards, and I'm not trying to say, I'm not accusing you of immorality, I'm saying if you don't necessarily have strong beliefs about left or right, and you want to be a successful politician, if you can figure out what's probably going to happen down the line and just be on the side of that, you will go down, and that's very Machiavellian, but you will be a successful politician. So Bismarck realizes later on, hey, these people want rights and they're going to get them. I want to be one of the politicians that gives them that so I can be successful. We'll come back to him later on. But just write in parentheses or quotation marks, whatever you want, Communist Manifesto, 1848. Karl Marx wrote his masterpiece, the Communist Manifesto, inside the reading room of the British Museum. I would like to go there one day. And I read years ago that if you went to the British Museum, or British Library, I think it's called, one of the two, the room where he wrote it is very famous. It's restricted, but if you are like getting a master's in history like I was, you can go in there and get a note from your professor and probably sit where he wrote Communist Manifesto. And here's what I tell my kids. Imagine him writing this book and looking out the window and seeing the fires of the revolutions of 1848 and the people being slaughtered in the streets, which of course is a dumb example. It's something I made up because he's in England. England was not one of the countries that had the revolution of 1848. Ever since the English Civil War, the English have been fairly happy. We're going to find some exceptions coming up here in this lecture. So the deal is, it's a very important thing that in 1848, I think, significant, he publishes his book. He could not have seen that the growth of the middle class. What he saw was people, the working class fighting the upper classes. And he said, this is ridiculous. There's going to be a war. Obviously, the working class greatly outnumber the bourgeoisie, the owners. And so the workers are going to win. The other thing he might not have foreseen is this evolutionary socialism. Eventually, there's going to be a book by a guy named Edward Bernstein called Evolutionary Socialism. And right now, let's not talk about the book. Let's just talk about what this means. Is socialism is going to change through the years. I have a friend of mine who works for the teachers union who calls himself a Marxist, And I tell him all the time, I said, you're making all this money. He left his job as a teacher to go make more money working for the union. And he says, yes, socialism has changed. We have 401ks. We have 403bs. We have more than one house. We drive nice cars. And I'm like, dude, you're a capitalist. Well, he doesn't accept that. He says socialism has changed. So in my opinion, it's not socialism anymore. But here's what I think evolutionary socialism really means. It means, all right, hope you're listening here. Instead of fighting in the streets and killing people, the working class can probably get most of what it wants by getting the right to vote, voting, and then voting for these things. And that's why a lot of these countries that are really capitalist countries have free health care. They have free college. They have that because the people voted for it. I've got a friend I have several people I know for some reason. I don't know any Norwegians or Danes, but I know a whole bunch of Swedes for some reason. In Sweden, a lot of Americans will call that a socialist country. It is not. They're free. They're powerful corporations. You can become a millionaire there. There is a very high tax rate there. My buddy from Sweden says there's two tax rates, 62% or 88%. 88% is a massive tax rate. I've never looked up to see if he was right, but that's what he told me. But the deal is, they have a lot of socialistic things that people voted for. And so if you give people the right to vote, and they vote for some socialist things like Social Security and things like that, then you don't need a revolution. So you understand? Marx believed you needed a revolution. Now, I'm spending too much time on this, but I'm giving you lots of important information that's going to come up. Lenin, when he takes over Russia, he had a chance to take it over without violence, and he passed it up because he had studied Karl Marx, and he says, there has to be a revolution in the streets. People have to die. Marxism is, Marx's ideas are deterministic. The evolutionary socialists would say that's not true. You don't have to kill anybody. It does, and we can do it, incrementally. Anyway, I hope you're not bored with this. I'm teaching you very deep, important truths about European history. And you're like, oh yeah, that's what every teacher would say. Let's go on. We're going to come back to a lot of these topics. The key one is revolutions of 1848. All right, moving on here. All right, golly, I said we're going to be done with Marx. I forgot about this. Years ago, when I went to London with my soon-to-be wife and my soon-to-be sister-in-law, we stayed in London 2 or 3 days. And the girls wanted to go see the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. That's the most important tourist attraction there. You go to the palace and you see the changing of the guard. This ceremony, kind of like the changing of the unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery in Northern Virginia, right there across from Washington. And so the deal is, I didn't go, I skipped it because I had the guidebook out and I saw that Karl Marx was buried in London and I wanted to go see his grave. So I spent a whole day just going to go see the grave of Karl Marx. And it's in this place called Highgate Cemetery. And I remember I had to take the subway over there, which is called the Underground, which is called the Tube, nicknamed the Tube. A lot of history there. That's where the Londoners hid during the Blitz in World War II. When the Germans were bombing London, the people would go hide in the subway. And the subway in London is way underground. Frequently, a bomb would drop on, above, and the people would be buried alive. So there's a lot of scenes of horror that happened there. Obviously, a lot of people's lives were saved there. And so there's a lot of history in the Tube. I spent like 2 hours in the tube getting to this part of London. And then I never forget, I got off the subway station and I had to walk up, got off at the subway station, I had to walk uphill. Golly, I'm sorry, my voice is so rough. I had to walk up this hill to get to the cemetery. And in England, unlike the United States, they do not really take care of their cemeteries. So this is one of the spookiest looking places I've ever been. It was beautiful. My favorite band when I was younger was Black Sabbath. Yeah, I know, for a Christian guy. But I believe they filmed one of their music videos here. This is absolutely spooky. And even the fact that the hill exists, according to the guidebook, medieval maps of London do not show a hill where the cemetery is. And so there was a theory that this hill was actually a giant burial mound where they buried thousands of people who died during the plague. Seems to me this would be very easy to figure out. You get a big bulldozer, dig a big hole. If you find, 80,000 skeletons, that's probably a true story. Anyway, I gave up the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace to go see Karl Marx's grave because he's buried in England. You catch the irony here. The greatest capitalist country in probably the history of the world. So here's some of the pictures from the cemetery. First off, I like dogs, but look how wild this is. And I just remember there's all these famous poets. I remember walking down these like little paths and seeing so-and-so's buried over here and recognizing the name. And so what they do over there is they bury people and then they don't cut down trees that grow up. So the tombstones, which used to be standing straight up, are now tilted over. And so this was like the most spooky place. And I was fascinated with it. So here's a bunch of pictures I thought I would show you. I mean, it's also stunningly beautiful. This is all Highgate. And look at this. I believe I went down this actual path because I just remember it was like a hiking path. Look at those tree roots sticking out. And we saw this all over England. Here in the United States, man, if there's a tree growing up that's, messing up, the graves, you cut it down. Eventually, now you can see that building through the fence there. But I remember thinking if I had my kids with me, I'd have to hold their hands. If they wanted to play hide and seek, I'd never find them. You don't want to lose your kids in the cemetery. And in a minute, Karl Marx, I don't know how many pictures I have. Karl Marx's grave is going to pop up. And it's massive. You don't miss Karl Marx's grave. Plus, there's signs going to it. And I remember when I came around, the cemetery was largely empty. When I finally came around this bend, worried that I was going to miss Karl Marx's grave because it had a bunch of trees growing through it, there's this massive, I don't even think you'd call it a tombstone, this massive edifice. Clearly Soviet, the Soviet Union probably went there and paid for this thing. You cannot miss this thing. And later on, when we get into the Soviet Union and what the first socialist country in the world did, they were pretty, they weren't subtle is what I'm trying to say. And so and so at some point I'm going to click and this thing is going to show up. But I believe the picture I have does not do justice to how big this thing is. Again, all these tombstones here, and boom, there's Marx's grave. And like I said, I gave you that quote a little earlier, and it's not the same as, workers of the world unite or whatever. This is a little bit different. Remember, he wrote this thing, and it's been translated. He spoke German, and he wrote it in England. So I think maybe that's why it has a slightly different quote here. And again, because I'm using a smaller picture, you see it sitting over the other pictures. What you see behind it is another picture. This thing was massive, and when I saw it, it was quiet, almost very, very worshipful and respectful, almost like people were coming to bow at the feet of Karl Marx. And later on, I'm going to talk to you about Lenin. I hope you know that Lenin's body is on display, and he died in the 1920s. His body is on display, has been there, I think, for like 94 or 5 years, on display in the middle of a red square. And for a country that is atheistic, they sure have gone a long way, the Soviet Union, to giving their people somebody to worship. And so I'm in this cemetery, which is largely empty. I come around this bend, and there's like 20 people there, very quiet. And of course, it's a cemetery, and they're standing there, and I was one of them. And believe me, I don't worship Karl Marx, but it would be wrong to think he was stupid. He was a visionary and someone you should read and understand. Even though I believe, for the reasons listed above, he was wrong. All right, moving on. The Romantic movement. Where's Hoovy when you need him? All right, so we have these different types of art. Romanticism is very often tested on the AP European exam. So here's what they believe. The Romantics, I think Americans think of Romanticism as someone being in love with someone. That's not necessarily what this is. Some of those violent paintings I've seen are romantic paintings. And Hoover's obviously can do a better job of explaining this. But you see it right there, emotional exuberance. It's very passionate. And my daughter my daughter and her best friend were water polo captains. Her best friend was salutatorian, and they both took Hoover's, and they loved Hoover's, and they loved Hoover's class. The girl who was salutatorian went on and got her degree in art history, and Hoover's used to always say, she's my claim to fame here at Apopka. This brilliant girl, studied art history because of me. And anyway, the year they took the AP Euro exam, it was different back then. You had multiple choice. You had a DBQ. I miss it. I vastly prefer the older exam to this new one. And then you had 3 essays and 3 essays. And the essays were divided by Napoleon. 3 up until Napoleon, 3 after Napoleon, and you picked one of each. It was wonderful. They gave you 3 topics. You picked the one you wanted to write on. And so one of them was on Romanticism. And I never forget, after the exam, both of them, my daughter and her friend, they're like, yeah, we passed. Why? Because Hoover's did such a good job of teaching us Romanticism, and that was one of the essays. And their essay was Romanticism's view of nature. They loved nature. All right. Anyway, your lifestyle, I'm giving you a chance to write all this down, should be lived with tremendous emotional intensity. And a lot of these guys rejected materialism. People, I think I've told you this, but I took speed reading in college, and speed reading taught us that if you're going to read quickly, I tested at 600 words a minute. My brother, the genius, can read 1,500 words a minute. I can't do that. I can't do 600 anymore either. Technically, it was 595. I'm rounding. But the thing is, they teach you don't look things up, okay? You don't have time. If you're stopping to look things up, you're not going to be able to read quickly. So what they said to do was read the words in context. In other words, read the words as quickly as you can. They also taught us not to read and they ignore the little stuff. Read the big words and read quickly. And if you see a big word, you don't know what it means, look at the words around it and figure out this is what it must mean. In other words, interpolate, I don't guess y'all use that word anymore, guesstimate. And so I have never probably looked up the word Bohemian, but to me, it means somebody who lives simply. And as usual, even though I'm on video, I'm going to go into story time here. I worked for 4.5 years at an airline. I've probably told you that before at some point. And we did not make a lot of money there, but we got to fly free. I mean, I've been to Europe twice and didn't pay either time. And so I went to the Bahamas like 4 times because we flew the Bahamas. And so a lot of people would go work for this airline just to get free flying benefits. So a lot of times you'd have a husband that makes a lot of money, or vice versa, and their spouse would work at the airline. And so one's earning the money and the other one's getting the free flying benefits. Anyway, for about 6 months, I worked in this one office. My title at the time was internal auditor, and there was a girl that worked with me. She's like 22, 23. She worked, there was like 5 of us that worked in there. And her husband both worked for the airline, which meant they neither one had any money. And so I'm just going to give you my definition of a Bohemian, okay? Because whenever I think of the word Bohemian, I think of this one girl. Because I remember she did not wear makeup. She had her hair cut very short. And you could tell she did not have a very extensive wardrobe, She wore the same things over and over, you know what I mean? Not every day. She probably had 5 work outfits, and she would wash them on the weekends. And I just remember, I can't remember her name, and I probably did not have that many conversations with her. But after, hearing her talk and working next to her for a while, I realized the only reason her and her husband worked at this airline was to fly free, and they went someplace basically every weekend. So they probably did not ever eat out. They probably, so what they did was, now just imagine this. This is my impression. What they did is every weekend they'd say, okay, we're going to get on a plane, we're going to fly to Virginia. And they would fly to the Bahamas, they would fly to England. So all their money, these are the kind of people that would almost been homeless living in a van. Maybe your version of hippie, live off the land, or like the rainbow people. Maybe one day I'll tell you about them. I've met some of them. They still exist in the United States. They're like 1960s hippies that travel the United States. The National Forest Service and Park Service have had it with them because they fill up the national park or national forest campgrounds. And like I said, that's Mr. Camper here has run into them there. And, I don't have a problem with them, but they do. They're modern day hippies, okay? And so what happens is this I could see her and her husband living in a van, spending every bit of their money, not on eating out, not on clothes, not on trinkets, not on jewelry, dressed very plain, spend every bit of your money in traveling. And so I think of that as Bohemian, someone who lives very poor. These people were, to me, traveling around the world is something rich people do. And so to me, someone who doesn't spend any money so they can travel is not necessarily rejecting materialism, but they're certainly rejecting things you can hold with your hand. So there's Bohemian. Here it is. That's the big thing you're probably going to see on the exam. Their view of nature. And they like stories. They like culture and folk tales and proverbs. I got to be honest with you. I'm fascinated with the Romantics. You're going to find out later on I'm fascinated. I'm not fascinated with the socialists because of how many people I know that, I've read about who've been murdered by these people. But the word socialism and murder are not the same thing. There's plenty of people who believe in socialism wouldn't hurt a fly. I'm talking about, obviously, Cuba, North Korea, China, and all of Eastern Europe. I'm very prejudiced by my generation and my life experiences, as you will be. You're going to have a very different deal because you're going through different things in your life. But I'm fascinated with the anarchists. I'm fascinated with the romanticists because of all this stuff here. Okay, their literature. Now, I'm about to name drop a whole bunch. Okay? So this is going to get intense here. We're going to go through a bunch of names. All right, so I'm going to just click and let you write. And when I go too fast, what you do is you pause the video and you write it down. Remember, you got a test coming up. I'm hoping to give it to you Thursday or Friday this week. There's a lot of meat in this chapter, and I want to get it done. Here's some of the most famous Romantic writers and examples of their books. George Sand was actually, I was just looking this up, was actually a woman. I don't know why she took a man's name. I know she's famous for dressing as a man. They felt like men. Here's what Wikipedia says about her. So I'm not really understanding this, and it's probably not that important. But men's clothes were cheaper than women's clothes. And I think probably some people think they were more comfortable. But what she did, that this was her pen name. Her name is much more complicated. Pushkin, by the way, we're going to learn a lot about the Russians. The Russians are some of the best writers and playwrights. And I think I said this in class the other day about one of the great American musical art forms is the blues. And the people who started the blues suffered, largely African American from the Delta of Mississippi, the former slave lands where they picked cotton. And so some people think that people that go through great suffering manifest great intellect and things like that. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that's what they think about the Russians. And so whenever you get into intellectual thought and literature, the Russians are going to really dominate this. And there's Pushkin. All right, just some names here. Mary Shelley obviously wrote Frankenstein. Sir Walter Scott, the Brothers Grimm, Rousseau. So just know these names and look out for them on the next test. This is romantic. I love this painting, and the kids have told me that Hoover says it's his favorite painting. I love this thing. I mean, look, he's standing up on the mountain. I'd be worried I was going to trip and fall. But anyway, there's romanticism. Here's a painting called The Bohemian. If you have hubris, ask him to explain it. I don't really get it. But again, my image of a Bohemian is someone who, here's the deal. I read a lot. And if you say somebody lives a simple existence, remember, I never looked this up. It would not, I got an Alexa sitting right over here, and my Google phone is sitting right here. I could ask Google about this. But when you read literature, when it talks about someone who lives simply, they would say he leads a very bohemian existence. My kids have moved around a lot. They've had like 7 different apartments. And so I actually told my son, I said, son, instead of buying all this furniture and stuff, I get it, you're a video game programmer, you got to have the biggest TV, I get that. But why don't you just get camping stuff? Have yourself a small bedroom and sleep on a cot on the floor. So when you move out of your apartment someplace else, you don't have to move a whole bunch of stuff. That would be living that way you can spend all your time playing video games. That would be living a bohemian existence. That's how you will see the word used in literature. Remember we talked about this. This references the Spanish civilians being executed by the French in Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Spain. Turner, Turner's one of the famous romanticists, and one of their themes, I want you to write this down, is the nature being ferocious. Nature will turn on you. As someone who spends a lot of time there, and I will this weekend, you can be having a wonderful day out there on a hiking trail or on a kayak, and then all of a sudden your life is in danger. Of course, that happens in the city too. Probably more often in the city now because other human beings. All right, I'm going to keep going here. All right, so what you're going to need to do is you're going to, I'm going to go ahead, as long as I'm talking about this slide, leave it on. But here's art and music, and I don't know what makes Beethoven a romantic. I don't get it with music, and I don't really care about getting it. You see the thing about the bottom, the Who? I only have one Beethoven joke. Are you ready for it? Beethoven composed for 40 years, and he's been decomposing ever since. You wouldn't have laughed either at home or if I was in class with that joke. All right, so you want to pause this and write all this down? Turner, by the way, is the guy we showed there earlier, with the ship and all that. A very famous romantic painter. And Romanticism, by the way, is supposedly a reaction against the Enlightenment. And it's also a reaction, I've always heard it was a reaction against the Industrial Revolution. But when I looked it up a few minutes ago, that's not what it said. And they don't like the fact that people try to use science to explain nature. Nature is unrestrained. And so I just like these people. All right, moving up, you can pause it, get the writing down, we're going to go on. This famous painting, I believe, is a Delacroix painting, and it's called Liberty Leading the People, and it is not the French Revolution. I believe it is the Revolution of 1830, which we're about to talk about. I told you this was a, complicated chapter, and to me, I don't call this Liberty Leading the People. I call it Lady Hanging Out of Her Dress. But the kids who have hubris say that, and there's a guy laying there without his pants on. I made a joke. I said, who goes to fight naked? Well, here we go on the David thing again. But so the kids say that's not what that means. That there were people so poor that after this guy was dead, they stole his pants. And again, famous painting, but this would be the Romanticism. A lot of AP Europe books have this on the cover. All right, national liberation in Greece. Okay, we're got to pick it up here, and you really need to listen because this chapter is confusing. Unit 3 is the hardest unit in the book, probably. 4 is the one at the end I probably have the most difficulty finishing because, you're just at the end of the year and you're exhausted. Unit 3 is about the 1900s, and it's called the Long Century. So here's the deal. We're going to have several revolutions. French Revolution spreads the ideas of peace, rights for everybody, definitely not peace. Well, the Ottoman Empire, Muslim Empire dominates the Greeks. So they revolt in 1821. There's an entire DBQ on this, what you're going to do. They revolt. The big question is, so these are Christians. Here we go with the religion thing again. These are Christians revolting against the Muslims. how are most Europeans going to side? Most romanticist Europeans are going to side with the Greeks for several reasons. Number one, it's the Christians against the Muslims, and it's romantic. They're fighting for their rights. And Greece is the birthplace of modern Europe. Not modern Europe. It's the, birthplace of democracy. Again, if you had Hoovers, he could wax, philosophical on the Greeks. So this is a big deal. So make sure you're hearing everything I say. You might want to add some notes. And here you go. There were Americans who went over there to fight on the side of the Greeks. They liked the idea of a national struggle. They loved the Greek classical culture. Birthplace of civilization. It's actually the birthplace of democracy. I think there's some other places around the world, especially the Middle East, where they would say, hey, we're the birthplace of civilization. And there's a typo here. Russians were stirred by the piety, P-I-E, not piety, whatever that is, of their Orthodox brethren. Remember, I don't know if I've talked about it. I have talked about it. The Greeks are more similar to the Byzantine Empire than the Catholics, right? And so the Byzantines are the ones who converted the Russians. So the Russian Orthodox Church and the Greeks have something in common. And they like the romantic idea of liberation. This is a big deal. Now, I don't know if this is going to show up in the notes, but I need to tell you this. Here's a question for you. Who's the great conservative of the age? Metternich. Is he going to be in favor of this? Well, he's a Christian. He's a European. You would think yes. No, and make sure you understand why. He doesn't want change. He doesn't want change, and he doesn't want the Greek people overthrowing their lords, their Muslim lords, because that means people in the Austrian Empire will feel like they could overthrow their king. And so he's against it, but eventually so many Europeans want the Greeks to win, he's going to have to be forced to change his mind. All right, I'm going to go on here. Liberal reform in Great Britain. The most important reason is remember, here's the growing middle class. Now, the English have had the middle class going for a while, which again is stunning. That may be, in my opinion, that Marx, who's living in England during this time, if you study Marx's life, he's similar in my mind to Voltaire. He gets kicked out of a whole bunch of places because he's a rabble-rouser. He actually came, I'm pretty sure, to the United States, Independence Hall. I could be wrong on that. I don't have time to look it up. And came here, in one of, leading his group and all that. Anyway, I've taught you basically everything about Marx you need to know. If you go on and get a degree in history, you'll need to know more about him. But now there's this middle class, and it's competing with the upper class. And so reforms begin. All right, so now there's a bunch of these laws, people, and I hate to tell you this, you're going to have to memorize them. The Reform Bill of 1832. There's the House of Lords, which is dominated by the aristocracy, and the House of Commons, not so much. Very similar, based to our Senate and our House of Representatives. The House of Representatives in the United States changes every 2 years. If you want to get a response, you want to write your U.S. government representative, you can write your senator or your congressman. Your congressman is going to be much more hurry to respond. Rick Scott is now taking over this, the committee to get Republican senators reelected. He's our former governor. He's a Republican. Republicans, man, as you know, as this impeachment talk is going on, is they're on the mat, to use a wrestling term. They're having the worst couple of weeks in the Republican Party in, a couple of years, a couple of decades, okay? They're on the mat. Rick Scott's got this job. Well, a lot of people want to get rid of Rick Scott, but he's a senator. He just got elected 2 years ago. He's got 4 more years. So if you hate him, you got 4 more years to forget how much you hate him. He's got 4 more years to rehabilitate his reputation. The representatives don't. They got 2 years. 2 years. And so they call that the People's House. And so over here, notice what's going on. Our system is patterned after the English one. They're giving the House of Commons the right to become more important than the House of Lords. So they're giving the middle class people more of a say. Remember what I said, why socialism is not going to run rampant in England. There's going to be socialism in England much more than here. What's going to happen is there's this growth of the middle class. And you see this right here. So make sure you know everything about the Reform Bill of 1832. And there's the concept of laissez-faire. Oh man, this is a big deal. Let me slide down here so you can see this. Now, so there is the most famous battle in European history at this point is probably the Battle of Waterloo. Anyway, during this time, there was a law passed called the British Corn Laws. Okay? And basically what they said is, now remember, these guys are supposed to be free traders, you know. Free traders mean you get to buy from wherever you want. Mercantilists would say, no, you buy from your country because you want to benefit your country. The capitalists aren't mercantilists. They're like, no, you need to buy the cheapest place you can. So if you're a poor person who's about to starve to death, you want to buy corn and grain, wheat and all that stuff. You want to buy that from whoever is cheapest, right? The government of England passes a law saying, no, you have to buy all your grain from English farmers rather than French or German or Prussian or whatever. And it is an unfair law because it was written to benefit rich landowners. Those people who claim that the Republicans are dominated by rich business people who pass laws and to their benefits, the same thing. A lot of people say the Republicans and the Democrats pass laws. You know, Biden's already, you know, coming under significant fire from the left and right about who he's putting in his cabinet. A lot of the socialists are very unhappy with who he's putting in his cabinet because they think he's picking, you know, people from, you know, Wall Street. It's, you know, it's a big deal. And if you don't follow American politics, I don't want to get you too far off track. But this was a selfish law. They passed it to benefit the rich landowners, not the poor. And so there was a riot. And the troops had to come and put it down. And it was nicknamed the Battle of Peterloo. Get it? It's not really a big battle between armies, but they're nicknaming it after the most famous battle in European history, the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon was defeated. All right. Usually during this time, somebody asks me, you know, what happened to Louis the 17th? Because there's Louis the 16th on the left who was executed. There's his son, which is, I don't know that he starves to death, but he's neglected and dies of neglect. And so when they have this big thing we're about to talk about, they find one of the dead Louis's brothers, who's even more horizontally challenged than him, and he's going to take the title Louis the 18th. Remember, the purpose of the Congress of Vienna is to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, and so they're going to go backwards. All right, so let's move on here. Okay, Ireland and the Great Famine. And what I'm going to do here is I am just going to click here, and I am going to let you write. Okay. I'm going to let you write all the way down here. And so at this point, now I'm going to go over this. And let me tell you this before you pause this and start writing. If there's any country that's had there's two countries in Europe that are really good at killing their own people. Number one, clearly, are the Russians. The other one is the French. There are 5 French revolutions. And I used to try to teach that before the review at the end, and it's very difficult to keep them straight. So anyway, you're about to see, we already had the 1789 revolution. Now we're going to get to the second one, the revolution of 1830. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this picture around so you can see this to copy this, and I will see you tomorrow. And I will go over the revolution of 1830 because it's going to be very, very important. Okay? So see you all tomorrow.